And for the invitation, thank you so much, Leslie, and the charm choir. That was wonderful. And thank you for all this delicious feast. So like Leslie said, my name is Emma Buckhout. I work on our Justice for Mexico and the Borderlands program at the Latin America Working Group. So I was telling some people that we cover everything from general human rights in Mexico, working with human rights defenders, justice sector reform, some of the general violence in Mexico, as well as migrants in transit, and then issues at the U.S.-Mexico border. We've helped coordinate a lot of NGO dialogue with Customs and Border Patrol. Do I need the mic?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Then I'll be plenty loud. Okay. Sure. So I think, like I said, I want to keep this fairly brief and hear more about Todd's book, but also kind of open this up for discussion. But when we were talking about the idea of violence at the border and the human cost of migration, I thought, particularly in the context of what we've seen this summer and some of the latest media coverage, it might be interesting, and for everything we've worked on at LOG this year, to discuss some of the issues of migrants in transit in Mexico, but also, what are we seeing with this surge, what's it called, a border crisis maybe, or all the other names we've seen in the news of the surge of kids and families coming from Central America particularly, also from Mexico. And not just what's happening at our border, but what's happening at borders south of us. So what we saw this year, and are continuing to see a little bit, is that in 2014, from the fiscal year, October to October, we saw 68,000 unaccompanied minors. So that meant kids traveling without their parent, basically, mostly from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and also from Mexico. The Mexico numbers were actually down this year, apprehended at the southern border, mostly turning themselves into Border Patrol or Customs officers. But also, what maybe was less publicized was the huge increase in family units, particularly young mothers with kids as well, which has obviously put a strain on our lovely U.S. immigration system. President Obama was very quick to call it a humanitarian crisis at our border. So again, what we've tried to look at with a lot of partner organizations, with partners in the region, is, well, what's the actual humanitarian crisis? What's happening in the region that's sending so many people here? So, I don't know, can I do a quick show of hands? Has anyone seen Los Invisibles? Amnesty International did a film in 2010 with Gael Garcia Bernal. Okay, great, that means I can show it. We're just gonna look at the first 5 minutes, because I think it's just a really great intro, and Gael Garcia is much more eloquent than I will be. So this is available on YouTube. There's also a DVD. And I will play it in Spanish, but it has the English subtitles. And
algunos que van de sus países porque quieren encontrar un mejor futuro, pero a veces en vez de encontrar un mejor futuro encuentra uno cosas que no espera uno encontrar, que le da mucha tristeza a uno porque todos vamos sufriendo. Que aquí en el camino es todo muy difícil, que peligra uno con su vida, lo secuestran a uno, otros le roban a uno dinero, violaciones de mujeres, de niños, entonces ven cosas muy feas.
Son muchos los que han secuestrado. Entonces, hacemos una fila y hay personas que están con su ratito pidiéndome el teléfono de sus familiares. Los que dicen no me acuerdo del teléfono normal. Me han dicho, me han contado, dice que no se cobraba el número y lo dejaron no lo dijeron y le mandaron un pedazo al otro. Para que se cobrara. O sea, los torturan hasta que ellos dicen que y si efectivamente no tiene familiares en Estados Unidos, no tiene familia en qué país por delante, lo meten frente a ellos, lo sacan, lo van esperando, y luego es un tanto de 200 litros de lo hacen calentar y ahí lo meten. Y muchas veces lo meten así, hasta en casa, donde lloviendo. Lo meten en ese tanto de diésel caliente, según para que no quede, para que se consuma todo, que no, ya no puedas hacer eso. ¿Cómo te imaginas que es Estados Unidos? Ahorita en la foto. Era una foto de esto, era una foto del SeaWorld. La ballena, las ballenas, delfines. Parece que para mí sería mejor estar en nuestro país, que El Salvador diera más oportunidades de trabajo, que todas las cosas fueran mejores para no tener necesidad de viajar a otro país, hacer otra vida. ¿Ustedes se sienten culpables de algo?
Yo sí me siento culpable de ser latina nada más, porque si yo fuera de allá, pues tal vez no nos trataran así, ¿verdad?
Esta familia viaja con 3 niños. El más pequeño tiene 1 año 8 meses. Es imposible imaginar de lo que vienen huyendo, al ver que están dispuestos a arriesgarlo todo por un futuro para sus hijos. Es incuestionable que todos tenemos ese derecho, el de mejorar las condiciones en que vivimos.
Nosotros como inmigrantes centroamericanos necesitamos una visa por lo menos para subir hasta el Distrito Federal por parte del gobierno mexicano para evitar esta inmigración y esta zozobra en esos trenes que son la peste de la muerte, donde uno cae, perece, se mutila, es seguido por los distintos grupos ya terroristas en México que secuestran al inmigrante, piden una suma de dinero, si no lo matan.
El gobierno mexicano no tiene colombiano, eso es claro. Lo que ha hecho, lo ha hecho con presión de las ONGs, con presión de la sociedad civil, que presiona, que denuncia, o sea, lo hace con presión. Tan fácil saber quiénes son los secuestradores, está fácil llegar a ellos. O sea, no quieren porque están cuando vienen las autoridades con ellos. Es sencillo. O sea, yo considero que es muy fácil para las autoridades llegar a saber quiénes son sus personas. Pero no quieren.
En estos albergues, los migrantes pueden descansar, dormir, limpiarse y comer. Pero lo más importante es que en ellos encuentran un remanso de seguridad que no encuentran en ninguna otra parte del trayecto rumbo a los Estados Unidos. También en ellos se les informa acerca de los peligros del viaje y la mejor manera de evitarlos. Allí encuentran a gente como ellos, de diferentes países, que también están haciendo el viaje. Comparten experiencias y apoyo que les ayuda a seguir adelante. Son solamente voluntarios los que trabajan en los albergues. La mayoría de ellos son mexicanos, que un día se dieron cuenta de las terribles condiciones en las que los migrantes hacen su viaje. Pero también se dieron cuenta de que podían ayudar a sus hermanos centroamericanos, dándoles lo mejor que se puede otorgar en la vida, la esperanza.
So, thanks. There are actually 3 more parts of that are definitely worth watching. They're all available on YouTube. But I think that's a really great sort of introduction to the plethora of issues that we're talking about when we talk about what migration is to the U.S. and why it's happening. I know a lot of people here are pretty well informed on the topic, so it's nice to be talking to a group of friends. But there was also a lot of misinformation or rumors or so many issues that we heard, especially in the news, from the government, especially this summer once there was this surge of kids. But it's clearly not a new phenomenon that people are migrating to the U.S. Or that kids and families are among those that are migrating, or that the journey here and what happens just to get here is also extremely dangerous. But it did hit a tipping point this year that I think has given us sort of the opportunity to say, well, let's use this political attention and see if we can actually start working on some of the root causes. So just looking at the basics of what's happening right now in the Northern Triangle, so in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, each country with its own set of issues, but definitely some things in common as far as the hugely increased levels of homicides, domestic violence, as well as a lot of poverty, lack of opportunities. I said, I'll cheat from the slide here, but 30% of the population of Honduras, 26% of the population of Guatemala, and 17% of El Salvador live on less than $2 a day. But they're also some of the highest ranked countries for homicides in the world. So Honduras being number 1, El Salvador and Guatemala being 4th and 5th. San Pedro Sula in the city in Honduras is the murder capital of the world currently. Also where many migrants are deported to. In the study Children on the Run this year, it's available in English as well from the UNHCR, UN High Commission for Refugees, found in interviews on the US-Mexico border that about 58% of the kids that they interviewed from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala would have qualified for some sort of protection, whether it's asylum or something related. And then the UNHCR in Mexico just published a study yesterday, maybe. I have a couple copies of the executive report, if anybody's, or executive summary, if anybody's interested. But they did a bunch of interviews of Central American youth, kids, or under the age of, I think, 18, maybe 23, and found that 48% of them reported that they were escaping some sort of violence. And they may not have directly linked up that that was the reason. Family reunification certainly plays a role, but they found that in at least 48% there was a significant level of violence that they were running away from. And so, again, I said I work on Mexico, so a lot of what we try to do is sort of bringing attention to what's happening on the journey through Mexico, and the context of what's going on in Mexico. Many of you know that what's been called the drug war since the last president came into office, Felipe Calderón, in 2006. So from 2006 to 2012, as many as 100,000, some estimates are even higher. The government stopped keeping official track in 2011. Have died in this war on drugs, on cartels. Many of them not at all involved in cartels. The government reports that at least 26,000 people have disappeared. Again, that estimate is often higher. Mexico is one of the worst countries for press or media. And also human rights defenders themselves often face threats. And it's one of the most dangerous places for migrants. So I took this from The Economist. It's a great slide on just the overall sense of impunity in Mexico, that almost none of these crimes are actually prosecuted to the full extent. There have been almost less than 8% in most cases of a sentence for any of, be it extortion, kidnapping, threats against journalists or human rights defenders. But at the same time, we're hearing since President Peña Nieto was elected in 2012, and is trying to sort of set about they implemented the Pacto por Mexico, the new pact for Mexico. It's a compromise among parties. They've instituted a plethora of constitutional reforms, including attacking the telecommunications monopoly, energy reforms, education reforms, And yet, while they've been trying to promote this great new narrative, a lot of the same old stuff has been happening, or at least 22,000 deaths in 2013, which is down from the 27,000 in 2011, but is still very high. And while violence has decreased in some of the sort of hot spots that we have heard a lot about, like in Ciudad Juarez, Monterrey, kidnappings and extortion are actually up. And some of you may have heard about the recent events in Iguala, the 43 students that are disappeared, probably killed. Also back in June, there were extrajudicial killings in the state of Mexico in Tlatlaya. Again, no follow through, no sentencing on all of that. These are some of the protests from Ayotzinapa. Happy to talk about that later if anybody wants to. So the context here is that as migrants, many people are migrating from Mexico still, but there's been a huge surge from Central America. It's undeniable. And what's happening is that people that are fleeing gang violence, so many issues in Central America are then being made even more vulnerable throughout Mexico. They're increasingly victims of kidnapping, sex trade, sometimes are co-opted into gangs there, are inevitably extorted. It costs about $3,000 to $5,000 to pay a coyote to get through Mexico. Often money is extorted from, like I said in the video, from family in the US. I think one of my favorite things that we get to do as the Latin America Working Group, since we were working on the policy side of things, is to bring people up from the region. So this year we actually have an info sheet if you want to learn more about some of the people that we've had in town. But this is Sister Leticia Gutierrez, who works for the Scalabrini mission for migrants throughout Mexico nationally. They accompany especially women, usually Central American women, who have been victims of some sort of violence on their way through Mexico. And so when she was here in May, they had at least 4 cases that they were accompanying of people who they had even Western Union tracking numbers of money that had been sent from the US to gangs in Mexico. She said that as people are going along the eastern route, they will inevitably, if people go along the Gulf of Mexico, they will be kidnapped. It's like 100% guarantee. And so it's not an easy thing to hear, but it's great for people like that to be able to come and speak to Congress or speak to us, and have those of us that are in the US, people like all of you, repeating that message. A little bit on what the US has done. I'm sure you've heard about this, but the numbers since the summer have gone down. There's a question of whether the root causes have not changed. What has changed is a lot of enforcement along the way. And so there's been a huge increase in deportations from Mexico to Central America, and often we're very concerned about the level of screening that's happening, probably even less than is happening from the US. On the US side, things are under control. The US government has managed the levels of people at HHS. They reassigned resources from Health and Human Security, or Health and Human Services, the justice sector. They're processing people quicker. The Vice President Biden went to Central America. The presidents met in DC, I think in August. The presidents from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras were just here this week. They had an event yesterday. And they're presenting their new plan for prosperity. And they're all so the US, in coordination with these governments, launched a danger awareness campaign, basically public service announcements telling people not to come, that the journey was very difficult. They launched an operation against coyotes, against people trafficking people. Like I said, have sped the hearings and removals and repatriations to try and send the message that no, people cannot say the US laws haven't changed. That was a huge rumor. And the government asked for extra funding, which hasn't gotten, but they've reallocated some resources. And like I said, we've really worked or supported this beefed up security in Mexico and Central America. The question is, what happens now? The US is sort of taking care of its crisis at the border, but nothing's changed for why people are coming. things have changed in Mexico. So I don't know if everyone's usually heard of La Bestia. There are pictures of people riding on top of the train. Mexico's cracked down on letting people on the train in general. They put up even stakes in places so that people can't physically get on the train. So we were talking about, Sister Leticia, for instance, said, I mean, that's the way that the poorest of the poor would go, because you don't have to pay someone to get in a bus or a car to go through Mexico. But maybe that's about 30% of people. But most of the shelter system that we saw in the video is set up along the train routes. And so now that people aren't getting on the train, we don't really know where they're going. And it's forcing it to be more underground in Mexico. So no, the train is certainly not a great way to try and ride away from your home or through a country, but increased enforcement without sort of paying attention to the consequences isn't necessarily the solution either. So we worked with a lot of organizations that work on traditional refugee issues, more on Central America, more on Mexico, have come together to sort of create a set of foreign policy recommendations for the U.S. that we're trying to work together with the State Department, with members of Congress, to sort of talk about, okay, what can we actually do that will help address these root causes? So issues of supporting safety and protection systems in Central America and Mexico. For instance, their child protection systems are extremely weak, if existent. Addressing sort of interdiction, border security in ways that don't put people at more risk. So making sure that if someone's apprehended in Mexico, that they are being at least offered their rights to claim asylum. If it's a child that's fleeing a direct gang threat, that they can have a chance to seek protection, whether it's in Mexico or in the US, but that they're not sent directly back to their community. And then building more safe repatriation and reintegration systems for the people that we are sending back. The US is going to continue sending people back, but how can they do so in a way that they're not sending them back to immediate danger? And addressing those root causes, things like job creation, education programs, community policing efforts, and strengthening the general judicial systems. So just this idea that we're trying to beef up the actual humanitarian solutions. So looking forward to discussion. I think we'll table any questions until after Todd, and then we can talk together.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.